Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today, I am so excited to sit down and talk to you about VIgil by George Saunders. George Saunders is a writer I have loved for so long. I love a lot of his nonfiction. I loved some of those early collections. I love the short story collections. Perhaps my favorite of all of his work is one that I think is kind of lesser known. It's called The Brief and Frightening Reign of Phil. That is a book that we absolutely must return to, so stay tuned. It's a very short book. It's illustrated, which is, kind of uneven for me sometimes, but it is truly exceptional. It is an exceptional piece of literature. It's very abstract, but also very political. So that will be amazing to dive into. But even more than Phil, I loved Lincoln and the Bardo so much. That is a book that truly, it's not often that I read things where I feel like they have actually changed my vision of the world, and that truly was a book like that. I actually had the enormous privilege of spending an entire day with George Saunders at one point. He was coming to the Bay Area for something else, and I was doing this series of bringing authors into my home and having bunches of people come, and I got to spend the whole entire day driving him around the Bay Area. We went to Diesel Books in Oakland. I was his chauffeur that day, or maybe I should say chauffeuse. That does not sound right, but also why so binary? But the day that I spent with him, it was like hanging out with someone who was truly enlightened. It was actually this very strange day where he was getting these phone calls from an old friend who was in really dire straits. And so he kept having to check in on this old friend. And it was actually kind of a harrowing situation. But in the midst of all of that, he was just focused and open and warm and calm and literally like everything that you would imagine George Saunders might be. It was honestly one of the best, and certainly one of the best literary days of my entire life. All of that is to say that when I heard about VIgil, I was like, I'm in. I will say right from the start, though, that some of his work is uneven for me. This is not someone, I have a bunch of writers where literally everything they write, I cannot get enough of it. His work does, to me, feel a little uneven, which honestly makes it kind of exciting to read. I also, if something isn't immediately resonating with me, I can still see all of the merit in it. And because the work that does resonate with me resonates so deeply, even the work that isn't my favorite work is still just a tremendous reading experience. So I have to say, when I heard about VIgil, and certainly the title kind of says it all, but when I heard about what it was about, I was like, why are we wading back into the Bardo? What is this kind of idea about the immediate post-death experience? And I was a little nervous. I was like, I don't know. I don't understand how this book could possibly meet the expectations or rise to the just enormous expectations that people have because of Lincoln and the Bardo. And I will tell you that my experience of the book, and I've, several people I have talked with about the book, and also quite a bit of the critical assessment and reviews and analysis that I have read since its publication, I do think that people are people who come in with very high expectations. I think that people feel like it is not as strong as Lincoln and the Bardo, which is, not that many people are making that direct, sort of assessment like that, but I think it is kind of inherent in a lot of what he is up to. Frankly, if he hadn't written Lincoln and the Bardo, this book, VIgil, would have been much better, in my opinion. And there was part of me that was disappointed to not be absolutely loving this book, but I did go in with a little trepidation. And even as some elements were not kind of gelling for me, were not really working the way that I love his work to work. That is a very convoluted sentence I just made there. But even as I was having that experience, again, I could absolutely recognize the ways in which this novel is also just an incredible reading experience. So today's lecture is going to be a little different. We're going to begin with kind of an amalgamation of some of my broader thoughts together with some of the things that I have read, in these critical reviews, and also some thoughts that come from interviews where I listened to George Saunders. So part of what happened is because I found the book a little lacking, I was wanting to understand what it was that George, we are kind of on a first name basis, although literally that was 15 years ago that we spent that one day together. But I wanted to understand what it was he was aiming to do, because I really did want to have the richest possible experience of this work. It's a little bit of a cheat and perhaps not the best way to read something, to kind of like backfill and to try to understand the aim of the author. But part of that is also a testament to the body of work that George Saunders has produced. I find it a little uneven, but it is so good. And there is so much that we have to learn from the work that I really wanted to bolster my reading. And I also thought, as I was preparing this lecture, that bolstering the reading of people who maybe are a tad disappointed by VIgil, bolstering their appreciation of the work is also, I think, a very worthwhile task. It also was just so fun. I mean, listening to many interviews with George Saunders was an absolute dream. So we're going to begin with this amalgamation. Then I'm going to quickly run through some of the shortfalls, some of the things that I think are really not working in the novel. And then I'm going to talk about a lot of the things that I do think are working. Then at the end, we're going to look at the prose, just some of the absurdity, some of the folksy kind of nature, some of the registers. He's working on a lot of different registers. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look a little bit at the humor, a little bit at the uncanniness. And then we're going to look at the end of the novel. I am going to assume that people have read the novel when they are coming to this. And we are going to kick off with maybe my favorite aspect of the novel, which is that throughout this novel, we have many references to gymnastics. I didn't even realize how much I was longing to marry my podcast together with my experience as a gymnast. So when I was young, I was very, very serious about gymnastics. I was, at the end of my career at 16 years old, I was 6th in the state of California. So let that be known across the land. Gymnastics is one of those very weird things where, like, you know, that's it. Like, I was 16. I still have many dreams where I'm 56 years old and they're like, no, you're up on the uneven parallel bars. And I'm like, what? I don't have abs anymore. Like, I can't do this routine. And they're like, no, we need you. And I'm like, okay. And then luckily, I always wake up right before I actually have to do any of the stuff, but lots and lots of gymnastics dreams. So you can imagine my delight when at the very beginning of the book, in my memory, it was on the very first page. It turns out it is on the second page. We have the introduction of Jill Blaine right from the beginning. I really liked her as a character, not only because of the gymnastics, but it turns out that Jill Blaine was quite the gymnast. And the way that we find this out and the way that it adds to her as a character was so incredibly delightful. So on the second page, not on the first page, we have this sentence. I found myself able, by sheer force of will, to bolt up out of the ground gymnastically, stand upright, both fully and consistently clothed. So, I mean, this is an adverb that is like maybe my favorite adverb of all time. Longtime listeners to the Fox page know that adverbs generally are not a writer's friend. It means generally that your verb is perhaps a bit weak, that you're relying on something, sort of medicating the sentence in a way that's usually not great. But in the hands of someone like George Saunders, of course, any adverb is going to be incredible. This one in particular was amazing. What is happening here too, this is actually a very big moment where the gymnast thing is coming out. She's, it's the very beginning of the book, and we're seeing her kind of emerge into this instantiation of herself, and she is doing it gymnastically. So, of course, that caught my eye, and I made a mark around it because I always read with a pencil. I would counsel you also to read with a pencil. And then I was absolutely delighted because not, 22 pages later, on page 24, we have this idea of Jill as a schoolgirl. She's 14 years old, and she's in Pennsylvania, and she could do 7 back walkovers in a row. So this I had some tiny mixed feelings about because I was like, oh my God, George really knows gymnastics, because he didn't say cartwheels. A back walkover is like a slightly esoteric gymnastics move. But I also was like, 7 back walkovers in a row is kind of absurd. Like, there's no way that you could practically do that. Like, that's not going to be in your floor routine or your beam routine, certainly. And I understood, obviously, there is some exaggeration here, but I was like, oh my God, she truly is a gymnast. And George is understanding, like, the shorthand. George is endowing her, with this kind of very childlike sport that she was good at the time. Perhaps one of the only ways where Jill Blaine really felt like she was a very competent person. And in some ways, this gymnastics prowess, like, it is part of why she feels competent. It is part of kind of like who she is as a person, one of her strengths. I also loved the fact that later, J.K. Boone, I'm going to keep saying J.K. but because of J.K. Simmons, I think, but it's K.J. K.J. Boone at one point calls her walkover girl, and I was like, oh my God, even he is recognizing this as like a kind of an important part of her personality. Actually, he said walk over gal, which is kind of more, that sounds actually more like KJ Boone than walk over girl. I myself would have preferred to be walk over girl than walk over gal. But he is very, it goes to this idea of him diminishing things and being slightly chauvinist, if not very chauvinist, if not misogynist. A little bit later in the book, we have this thing where she vaulted, which, I mean, honestly, in that case, I think I was stretching a little bit. She vaulted like out of something. And in my mind, of course, I was thinking of the vault, the event. But I think actually, no, I think it just meant like you can vault in lots of different ways, not only gymnastically. And then I have to say, there was a sad moment for me when at the end, there's like a tragedy that occurs, which is that 8 gymnasts are killed in a bus crash, which I appreciated the fact that the gymnastics, like it was so kind of ingrained that we actually had a tragedy that also involved gymnasts. I like to kind of push that one out of my head because obviously that is not a great gymnastics memory. So obviously you can hear from my voice that some of this is in jest. Like some of this is just me like being absolutely delighted and having a good time talking to you about like the book that finally allows me to talk about my experience. But what is more important is actually the seed of it is in what I just said, is this idea that there are aspects to this book that are so incredibly relatable. We have not only KJ Boone, but we have his wife, we have his daughter, we have Jill, we have Jill's husband, we have Jill's parents, we have KJ Boone's parents, and of course Saunders being Saunders, I think he's really trying to make all of these people multidimensional so that we really can relate to them. Jill Blaine, for me, we're about to discuss this, is really the heart of the book in lots of ways. And this idea of being a gymnast, again, I'm jesting a little bit, but it's a sport that because you have to do it when you're young, you do get the sense that this is someone who peaked when she was very young. This fixation on gymnastics, I mean, it's not like, you have people in their 50s who are still doing their gymnastics. It's like it's a very, it speaks to the idea of like your sports career being truncated. It's like it's over by the time you're a teenager. And, Jill Blaine dies when she's 22 years old. So you have a sense that her gymnastics, I mean, if I died when I was 22, like my gymnastics, it's still like a point of pride. But it really would have been a point of pride because you don't have all that much to show for your life by the time you're 22 years old as compared to when you're older. But it is indicating to us that she is someone who led, a short life and really has a youthfulness that I think the gymnastics actually underscores. Importantly, that ability to relate, he does it in more sort of abstract ways too. There's a point where she's thinking back to school. I think it's her. I mean, honestly, it could have been a different character, but she was talking about times tables being difficult. And we have, KJ Boone remembering the scents of his kitchen when he was young, the different smells there. We have all of these kind of nostalgic things that the characters are experiencing, but they are allowing all of us points of entry because they are specific and because they are really loaded in the sense of what they are. I mean, if you're remembering scents from the kitchen, that's the heart of the home in lots of ways. It's a domestic environment. It's speaking to the sense of smell, which is very, kind of old and very primal for us. So in each of these moments, he's allowing us a point of entry, but also giving us something that is significant. There's also a certain kind of folksiness, which we are going to discuss. There is lots of this in George Saunders. It's actually a shortcoming in this book, I think. I have in my notes, like, no one swears. I'm like, literally no one is swearing in this book. You have all of these like business tycoon people, and a lot of them are in Texas. And I was like, truly, is no one swearing? Is everyone saying like, gosh darn? Which for me, it became a bit of a drawback. But this is a very George Saunders thing to have this kind of gentleness and this kind of folksiness. And there is a nostalgia in that. There's a sense of things being lost. There's a sense of time. This, interestingly, is a book that is taking place in the like 60s and 70s for the most part. I mean, we go back in time, certainly. But, Jill Blaine is born in 55 and dies in 70, whatever. She's 22. So, I think those dates are correct. I will get to them later in my notes. But it is a bygone era, which I think is a very interesting choice. I did some thinking about that, and I like the way that it was able, we were simplified. We're not talking about cell phones, and we're not having to deal with, the internet. Like it's such a different world, the world of the 60s and 70s, than even any part of the 21st century. I like the nostalgia of it, and I like the idea of it being at the very beginning of people really understanding the like destruction that humans were wreaking upon the planet. But part of the reason why that era is so well depicted is because of this nostalgia and because of this kind of folksy kind of innocence. And I really do think that gymnastics, there's lots of nostalgia and there's lots of like weird optimism and there's lots of kind of innocence and a folksy quality to the gymnastics that I think is significant. It's also funny. Saunders is known for his humor, and he's known for like a slightly off-kilter, sophisticated sort of humor. And the idea of KJ Boone calling her walkover gal, there is something that's very sweet about that, but there also is a funny aspect to it that's this kind of light humor that really leavens things in an important way. And lastly, I think all of this gymnastic stuff really gives us a sense of immediacy because, in fact, it is so specific. Like, this is obviously, it's a very specific vision that we have of this gymnast. Gymnastics is kind of a weird thing for her to be doing. It's like a very specific thing. She's not just like going out for a jog. So you do have this sense of immediacy and a sense of memorable aspect, especially because he keeps returning to it. But always that immediacy and the kind of the motif of it, the way it keeps repeating, there's a lightness to that is so incredibly appealing. So we've done a weird little digression here about gymnastics, but the thing that's important is we could have done this in a bunch of different ways. With the Frenchman, the fact that he developed the combustion engine, that is something, that we could, it's like the primary thing about him, other than the fact that he is speaking French. And that is not to say that Jill Blaine's primary thing is the fact that she was a gymnast, although, like, in my mind, it kind of is. But you have, for each one of these characters, there are these kind of really controlling ideas about them, kind of like these aspects that you could pull out for each person. And each one of them does this thing where it makes it feel immediate and light and optimistic and nostalgic and concrete enough that they do feel like round, complex characters. And this is a good segue into this idea that in many ways KJ Boone is held up as is it KJ? I think, yes, Kenneth, yeah. KJ Boone. If you're reading the synopsis on the back or the jacket copy or whatever, or you're hearing about it, it is, it's this man who is on his deathbed, this very powerful guy who may or may not repent during the course of this novel. He, in many ways, is at the heart of the novel. He's like kind of the focus of the novel. But I would argue, and in the interviews that I listened to, I think you can argue that this really is a story just as much about Jill Blaine. So before we dive into the idea of these two characters, I wanted to just speak very quickly to the idea of names. So the names all throughout are important. Right from the beginning, I was like, Jill Blaine, obviously Chill Blaine, which was so interesting to me because in some ways she is a really tragic character. So you have this idea of suffering, but I also was a little bit like, I don't know, especially meaning I thought that Chill Blaine perhaps was like me just kind of riffing in a weird way. And of course, when you add the doll in the middle, you lose like the Chill Blaine aspect. So the idea of doll, you have the sense of that being an endearment. Someone is calling her doll, whether it's her parents or whether it is her husband. So you have this idea of her as being kind of precious, but also as being young. Like she's a doll in the sense that she's someone who's still associated with dolls. She's still associated with childhood because she is someone who is, again, she died at 22. She died almost not as a girl. She's obviously a young woman, but really didn't get a whole lot beyond childhood. We also have this idea of Blaine as being close to blame. So one of the things that's happening throughout this book is she is trying to comfort this guy, and she's really struggling in some ways with it. And when we are thinking about KJ Blaine, there is a lot of blame that is meant to being, she comes to a different conclusion. We're going to talk about her philosophy later, but this idea that things are inevitable and her desire to comfort him mean that she's not going to really blame him. So it's kind of an ironic name for her because she has this, her last name is Blaine, which is close to blame, but she's kind of mostly trying to say like, it's fine. You didn't have any, control. Like you were always going to be who you were going to be. So the Frenchman, of course, is a little bit more like, actually, you did do something wrong and you should repent. But so it's interesting to think that Blaine here it's not blame, partially because that's a weird last name, but also because she's not actually doing that thing. Of course, Boone is pretty obvious in the sense of like, it's a boon for him that he has become this very successful man. You also have kind of this idea of booming, like, boom town and, gold panning and mining and oil extraction. All of these things are these kind of boons that lead to these booms. You would have an oil boom. But one of the things that was so interesting to me is that when George Saunders was talking about this main character, the male, the guy who is dying here, who really is, I think for most people, if you don't think too hard about it, he's the focus of the book. It was very interesting to hear George Saunders talk about this character. So one of the main inspirations that George talked about with this book was his experience on the oil fields. So he talked about being a young man on these oil fields in this very kind of primitive situation in Jakarta. He talked about like this kind of old canoe that they would put this computer on. It was like this very sophisticated, very expensive computer. And it was like this group of them that were like this team, and it was very adventuresome. Like it was a really different life than his upbringing. And he had all of these, he speaks to just like the excitement of it and the adventure. At that point, he didn't have a really good sense about all of the like horror that the oil business was going to wreak on the planet. But you kind of expect him to villainize KJ Boone, and he doesn't. So you have this idea of George as wanting to have there be some kind of positive aspects to this KJ Boone character, to have at least a sense of like him as feeling like he's part of a team and feeling like he's leading a team and feeling like he is doing something good in the sense that he's allowing for a lot of, quote unquote, progress. I will say that even as George was explaining this idea and the excitement of doing the thing that this oil tycoon has done, it just didn't quite hang together for me. KJ Boone was someone I could never get behind. Like I never understood it. There was never an appeal to me, partially because he is so unrepentant and just like so unrelentingly unrepentant, but also because he's just a dick. I mean, he's just like not a good person. And we see that again and again and again. And in some ways, Saunders does a good job of showing us why he is this way. He's someone who's very small of stature. Sounds like he didn't live up to his dad's expectations. There were a lot of things that happened in his youth that really shaped who he was going to be. And on some level, I knew that I was meant to like have some sympathy or at least just kind of understand who he was as a person. And I could never quite get there. And some of this has to do with Jill's kind of philosophy that I really liked, this idea of this inevitability, that no one has a choice in what they're doing. We do, of course, need to be responsible for our actions, which is the real problem that KJ Boone never seems to understand. But this idea that we are always going to be who we are, that we are shaped by, genetics and by experience. Jill can find sympathy for this man because of that, because he didn't have a choice in anything, that was happening to him. I was very interested in the idea of religion. The book actually uses capital G God in many different ways, in like kind of confusing ways for me. Like I was like, wait, is George embracing like a Judeo-Christian kind of, like very straightforward idea of God? My fantasy is that George is like through and through Buddhist. He really does. I mean, obviously Lincoln and the Bardo being a Buddhist idea of the period immediately following death. He's clearly someone who is very well versed and steeped in the idea of Buddhism. So I was a little confused. There were some Buddhist moments in this about kind of everyone being, part of everything. But Jill's whole argument really had to do with predestination. I was like, this is sounding a lot like predestination. And then like 2 pages later, George uses the word predestination. So you have this idea of the inevitability of things and the fact that we don't really have any free will. In one of the interviews, George did this amazing thing where he was talking about being very young, like in 1st or 2nd grade, and they were learning to read, and he had a very good friend who was like next to him in the classroom, and reading was such a pure delight, and it came very easily to George, and he looked over, and this cute friend of his was like practically in tears because he just couldn't do it. And even at that point, at like 7 years old or 8 or however old you are in 2nd grade, I forget these things, or 1st grade, he had this sense of just, the die is cast. Like people have strengths and they have, shortcomings. And it was very clear to him that there is this inevitability to things. And you see that kind of inevitability playing out not only with KJ Boone, but also with Paul Bowman, who is the guy who is also totally unrepentant. He's the guy who killed Jill by accident in the bombing. So this really is, you have a very clear manifestation of the idea of predestination. And if you're taking that to its ultimate, then there is no need to repent for anything because, we need to be responsible for our actions, but there's a way to think about them as being, sort of fundamentally out of our control. So Jill has a lot of generosity. But I want to move on and talk about Jill a minute, because for me, I mentioned this before, I think she really is the heart of the book. And when one of these interviewers asked Saunders to give like a précis, like kind of what would you say the book is about, he started with K.J. Boone and said, it's the life of this oil tycoon, but it is also a day in the eternal life of a guardian angel. So I think George is wanting to have us understand that both of these characters are really primary. It's very significant to me that the story is told in the first person from Jill's point of view. So she's falling down, and right at the beginning, she says, I was plummeting toward the earth or whatever it was, and she's kind of, like manifesting. Her body is like coming back together. So you have this sense of her as being the locus of the story. She is the voice that we are hearing for the most part throughout the novel. It's the only first person that we're really consistently and deeply engaged with. So Saunders said that when he was young in his family, they lost several different young people. And now he's 67 years old, and now he is doing quite a bit of thinking about all of the things that those young people missed because their lives were truncated. And it's interesting to me because most of what Jill is doing is kind of looking back at her life. And so it's this very nostalgic view of weddings and of childhood and of high school and of, first being in love with her husband. All of these different, memories are what are pulling up for her. And we do have a sense of her like having missed out on things because, of course, her husband remarried right away in kind of a shady manner, perhaps. And he went on to have children, which was something she wanted to have. So you do have a sense of her having missed out. But for me, the most important, idea here is that she's looking back at these things with a lot of nostalgia because those are the elements who really made her who she is. There are also elements that in a very handy way tell us a ton about the idea of climate change, which is, of course, at the very heart of the book. So one of the really interesting things that George Saunders said is that when he was talking about the job that Jill does, he called it her self-appointed job. So one of the things as I was reading through the book is I was taking all these notes on kind of like the mechanics. So Jill would talk a lot about the idea of like people of or beings of our ilk. So there's this whole group of people who are, like stuck in something very much like the Bardo. This is kind of like they haven't gone, to eternal rest. There are other people who have, like her husband just zips right by her and goes on to eternal rest. And she's very hurt by the fact that he doesn't even, come to try to find her. So of course, this begs the question, like, how does all of this work? Like, why are some people like hanging out in this kind of zone where they're helping other people through this transition versus people who are just going to transition right into whatever it is they're going to experience next? Of course, I also wanted George Saunders to tell me what is going to happen next. I was like, okay, now is the time that you should tell me what happens when we die. Shockingly, George Saunders did not have an answer for that. And I mean, honestly, like I have him on such a pedestal that I was like slightly disappointed that he didn't even try really. Like I don't think that there's like this big idea of like heaven and hell. There wasn't a lot of stuff about fire and brimstone. But honestly, if you're someone who's inclined in that direction, you do wonder if K.J. Boone is totally unrepentant, like what is going to happen with him? So we don't get that answer, but I did think a lot about the mechanics, about how like this whole thing is working. So it was very interesting that he said that it was her self-appointed job. So you get the sense that someone who has a big heart, perhaps, I guess, is someone who would want to comfort other people. I'm now imagining a few of the other people. The one woman who went out for the chip run and got hit by the car, and she's hanging out with the other guy. She did not seem like someone who has like a gigantic heart and was wanting to like comfort other people. So I have some questions about the mechanics, which I think is great. Like he's not going to give us all the answers to sort of how this whole system is functioning. And I did really like the idea of like someone who would comfort you through this transition. There was a part about everybody facing a lot of fear and like being on the wrong side of a door and everything you love and care about is on the other side of the door. And I was like, oh no, like, let's not do that. Let's just think about this as being an easier transition. But again, I mean, George is not going to just like, His job is not here to comfort. So it's important to step back and think, like, what is the point of this? Like, what is Saunders trying to do here? And he's very clear about that in some ways. What he is trying to do is provide us with people who resist easy judgment. And again, I don't think that fully succeeded for me where KJ Boone is concerned, because I did judge him, and I didn't find a lot of evidence to not judge him. I loved Jill, of course, and so maybe I just judged her in a little bit of a facile way as well. But what he was trying to do was to create characters that you don't immediately judge one way or the other. And then, because of that, he wanted to produce in the reader something he called benevolent confusion, because you're having an experience of people that isn't immediately black and white. It's a conversation about something, in this case climate change, that's raised to a slightly different level. Instead of simply having, heroes and villains, what we have here is this question of, like, maybe KJ Boone had no control over this, and maybe he doesn't need to be repentant, and maybe Jill has faults, although I don't see too many of them. And if his aim is for us to be questioning and to be having some benevolent confusion, I do think that is the case. It is a book that makes us think a lot about, like, what is accomplishment? He himself mentioned that at the end of our lives, that the accomplishments don't matter at all. And of course, it is all of the interpersonal stuff that matters. And in that regard, I think we see some really beautiful illustrations of that gone awry in the case of KJ Boone, who was really awful to a lot of people. And Jill seemed to have done a little bit better than KJ himself. And one important element of the idea of this, like, benevolent confusion, and the idea of having a conversation or conceiving of these people and not making very, like, quick judgments about them, the idea of them being a little bit more complicated and having to kind of wrestle with that as the reader, that is Saunders speaking to, like, what it is that he's trying to get this book to do. But the other thing that was very important to me, and in some ways kind of like easier to like understand and to take hold of, is the idea that stories put us in a more solid relationship to the truth. So one of the things that this book does very well is to depict climate change. We have that just gut-wrenching part, literally gut-wrenching part about Mr. Booty, who is literally, like, he and his family are dying of thirst and starvation. We have, a lot of depictions of the weather that are terrible. We have that unforgettable scene with all of the birds. There was one time where I thought we went a little bit too far, and where we had when Jill and, like, they're like on some sort of double date kind of thing, and then her husband and the other guy are going out and they're sledding in the mud, and I was a little, like, I don't know, like, it got a little bit slapsticky for me. And honestly, I have so much anxiety about climate change that I was like, let's not go so far that it becomes like kind of a farce, because I really did want this to be an indictment. I really wanted this to be a book that came down really hard on climate change. And Saunders articulates very well the idea that truth is a resistance. Like, speaking the truth is an act of resistance. And of course, this is one of the main ways that KJ Boone has failed. He falsified a bunch of stuff. He, like, drummed up a bunch of studies with a bunch of, like, 1,400 scientists or 7,000 or whatever it was. Numbers are not my strong suit here. But, all of these scientists who were not scientists, who said a bunch of garbage that really made everybody feel better about a situation that was really, really dire, not to say existential, for the planet. So you have that kind of, like, willful deceit, but you also have all of this rationalizing. So we have him rationalizing constantly. One of the best examples of people rationalizing is Paul Bowman. He's the one who set the bomb that killed Jill. At one point, Jill's grandmother later says that he never repents and that he made himself the victim of the event. Like, it's, people can be so effective in terms of denying the truth and of rationalizing things that they really can convince themselves of something that's absolutely not true. So Saunders is really exhorting us to think about the facts here. He's not offering a ton of them. He's offering these, like, kind of exaggerated illustrations of the direness of the situation, which I do think is effective. The one thing I will say about this is, like, and this is such a strange thing, and it was kind of a strange feeling, I kind of felt like it was a little too much of the climate stuff, which is absurd to say, but it was like we had just like, I wanted there to be a little more complexity in terms of who this KJ person was, and we kept coming back again and again and again to these examples of climate, like, destruction, and it wasn't even that I was finding it, like, hard to read in the sense of, like, feeling terrible about the environment, which I already do. I was more kind of like, I feel like we've done this terrain. I feel like we understand the point about climate change. So for me, I mean, I can't believe I'm saying this, but for me, it felt like a little bit of a one note. And I wanted climate change to be that force. I wanted that to be the focus of what it is that KJ Boone has totally fucked up. But I also like wanted there to be a bit more complexity in terms of like his, you know, who he was as a person and what the novel is kind of problematizing. So just to wind up the idea of these two principal characters and the way that those two characters are really like illustrating the main points of the novel, which is that we are not supposed to judge them and we're supposed to have a slightly more kind of elevated, less knee-jerky kind of conversation or conception of all of this stuff. But that we're also supposed to be thinking about this idea of predestination and inevitability. And lastly, Saunders was talking about this idea that the book is really about how we can comfort someone. And you do have these kind of competing forces between Jill, who's really just saying like, it's okay, you're fine, you did your best, you know, it's going to be okay, versus this Frenchman who's like, you really need to take responsibility for your actions. And even at the 11th hour here, we need you to repent. And again, because the mechanics are kind of mysterious here, we don't really know what 11th hour means. I mean, I don't know if we're meant to believe that like if KJ Boone repents, he's going to like go to heaven, and if he doesn't, he's going to go to hell. We don't really have those indications unless I missed them. All of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, what if those indications are there and I just missed them? I do not think that we have anything that is that simplistic, but you have these competing arguments about like everything's fine versus like we really need to be very critical of ourselves. And all of that is wrapped up in this idea that Saunders stated so well, which is this idea that it is a book about how to comfort someone. So the question, you know, the self-appointed job is that she can comfort people. And that word comes up again and again and again. So one of the questions is like, how can we be most effective as a human in terms of comforting someone else? So whether it is that we just need to like let them know everything's fine, or whether we need to like have them like help them take a hard look at themselves. It's unclear which of those, and probably it should be some kind of like, you know, mishmash of both of those things together. But it was really interesting to think about the book as one that is really, you know, asking how is it that we can best comfort one another? So we're going to move on to talk about, just kind of in a more schematic way, the ways in which I think the novel falls a little short and the ways in which I think it is working well. Some of this we've already covered, but I'm just going to zip through quickly to kind of give you like a broader sense. So one is that I had a hard time like having any sympathy for this main character because he was so unrepentant and frankly so repellent. Like he just is a really repellent person. I also have these questions about God that it felt kind of unsatisfying. Like I was okay about not understanding the mechanics of the thing, but I was like, what kind of like, there's a bunch of references to capital G God. And so I'm a little like left, like, what am I meant to make of that? It didn't, and I don't need it tied up in a bow, but I felt like we didn't have quite enough of a sense of like where the book stood. I mean, on the question of capital G God. I think part of that is that the Lincoln and the Bardo concept was so Buddhist that I was a little bit like, wait, now are we treading in a more like kind of straightforward Judeo-Christian kind of world? We are in Texas. I was a little like, I wanted that to be slightly more clear. I also felt, I mentioned before that there was like a little too much repetition of the climate change, you know, idea again and again. I also felt like there was a little too much repetition of this guy as being unrepentant. Like I didn't need to see him being unrepentant again and again and again with the two figures that like the work people he used to work with, or with the Frenchman, or with his daughter, with any of these people when he's in so much denial. And not to mention all of the times that he's with Jill, where he's such a dick to her. And he's also just not at all interested in any kind of like self, critique, let alone any kind of like, raising self-awareness. One quick note, as I was talking about those two, the two kind of ghosts, the two spirits that come to him, I did think of A Christmas Carol. This is a book that I did a seminar on in December. It was top of mind. It is a fascinating short story by Dickens. And this book is like, there's so much of this book that has to do with that I'm like, obviously he was thinking of Dickens. It was very satisfying to know that Saunders will say that Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol in particular are like the basis of almost everything he writes. That's a little bit of an overstatement, but he sort of was like, it is the story that is like most present in all of my writing. He had this incredible story about being like 8 or 9 and being at a friend's house, and it came on the television. And it was the version of A Christmas Carol that had Mr. Magoo in it. And this concept just like became so salient, this idea of being visited by these spirits and doing some thinking. I mean, he's obviously a child who was interested in this idea of what happens after we die, because we have the Bardo, and we have this idea here, like really what is kind of a rewriting of A Christmas Carol. It is a very Scrooge-like character that we have at the center of this novel. It's really interesting to kind of map it all. I think of those two, like his business partner people who come back. They're both named Ron. Gosh, that's not correct. I'm not going to remember their names right now, but they both have the same name. And to me, I just kept picturing the Muppets. In A Christmas Carol, a couple of the ghosts are those Muppets who always sit up. They're like the old curmudgeonly like guys that have like white hair. They're probably bald, one of them. They sit up in the theater like in that box, and they're just like old cantankerous old men. I just kept thinking about those guys. He also mentioned how much he really loved the Charlie Brown holiday specials, particularly the Christmas special. And this was so telling to me. He said what he liked about them is you have these really important, very like profound ideas of loneliness or disappointment or lack of human connection or frustration, all of these things, but in bright packages. So I think a lot of what's happening in this book, can be, read in a similar vein. We have a lot of humor, we have a lot of absurdity, we have a lot of kind of outlandish stuff. Some of it's kind of cartoonish. So we have these kind of bright packages. We have this young gymnast, we have who dies in a car bomb. I mean, it's all very kind of over the top in some ways, but those are those kind of bright packages in which he is delivering, these very profound ideas. That's a very good segue into the next point I was going to make, which is there is a certain shallowness to Jill. And I hadn't mentioned that yet, but I think some of the idea of her looking back at this nostalgic moment, or moments, there are many of them, it's like, I felt like, yes, I have these memories and they were very evocative for me and they produced a lot of nostalgia in me, but I didn't quite have enough to hold on to. I had a hard time, her boyfriend was like really handsome in high school and she like couldn't believe that he fell in love with her. There were aspects of her that I was having a hard time like seeing as coherent, and I wanted just something a little more than the nostalgia. I will say that part of the reason why I think I had that problem is because I listened to the audio version. I love to do that where I have both the book in hand with my pencil, and then I also will be listening to the audio. And Saunders mentioned at one point how much he really likes the actor who voices Jill. I didn't love it. It made it too light to me. And at first I was like, maybe that's because I'm listening to it at 1.3, but I put it back down to 1.0 because I'm like, I'm not going to do her dirty like that. I'm not going to do George dirty. I'm going to just like listen to this like in the way it's meant to be listened to. And I was like, it was too like comic or too light. There was just something about the voice of the main person who's narrating the book that I was, and there are lots of different voices. There's actually Stephen Rood, who's an actor. If you don't know that name, you would definitely recognize his face. And his voice was so recognizable to me, and he was KJ Boone, that I was like, it just was distracting. Like listening to the audio book was actually not, I don't think, it did not help my experience of the book. And I think it did add a little bit to this like shallowness that I felt in Jill, and also the way that I couldn't kind of get my mind around each of these characters. One, because I was like, okay, this is just Stephen Rood. Like now I can't remember what I've seen him in on television, which is not what you want when you're hoping to dial in to the person in the book. And again, Jill just felt a little bit too light. There was also some tone issues for me. Sometimes it felt a little too outlandish, a little too slapsticky. I also felt the same way about the folksy nature of it. This is where I was like, truly, no one's going to swear? No one is swearing? Like, I felt like, I mean, I know we were talking about innocence and nostalgia, but it's kind of like there was too much of a one note, and too many people were like, gosh darn it, or like, dang, or like there was too much of a register, kind of a folksy, nostalgic, like Americana kind of register that didn't, it felt too one note. It didn't feel like distinguished enough for each person. Then I had the problem that, and I do speak French and I love a good French accent. I had a problem understanding the Frenchman in the audio version. That was yet another problem. And the last thing I'll say in terms of all of these like shortfalls that I'm saying, and this again feels kind of blasphemous, part of me is like, maybe this was a short story. Maybe this was really meant to be a short story. And again, this is blasphemy. Or maybe it's a novella. Or maybe it's like, it anchors a collection. And it's like the long short story that anchor collections sometimes. And I know everyone wants a novel from George Saunders, and I want a novel from George Saunders just as much as everyone else. But I did, like, once I latched onto that idea, I was like, I feel like it could have been edited even further, which was not a great feeling. One tiny little like grievance that I had is that one of the ways that people would be held up as like having accomplished a lot was that they had traveled. So it's like, this is someone who had incredible self-worth because they traveled all over the globe. And some of it was tongue in cheek because, at one point KJ Boone is talking about how his daughter, traveled everywhere. And I understood it was sort of satirical at different points. But there were other points where like, oh, I think it was Mr. Booty, the man who was dying of starvation. They're like, he was someone who traveled the globe and like, who visited all of these different places. And I'm like, why is traveling the globe like this accomplishment that we are seeing in at least two of the different characters in the book? That was a very small thing. But like, once you have those kinds of things accumulating, then you're in trouble. And now I want to talk about the things that I think really were working well. And unfortunately, this list is shorter, but I want you to think about each of these as having a lot of weight because I really do think they worked really well. One was the idea of climate change. I felt like we hit it maybe too many times, but it was so horrifying. And I think some of this idea of like pulling apart the way that these large corporations, these oil corporations were just feeding the world all of this bullshit. Like, I think we all knew that, but I really liked the way that was underscored. The relatability, again, was so excellent. George is so good at like these characters that allow people to really see themselves both in, good ways and in bad. I loved that relatability. Part of that is because he's very good at speaking on all of these different registers. And I think we're going to take a look at that. He has this kind of folksiness, but he also can speak in these registers that are very scientific or that are very whimsical, that really do capture different people's kind of essences. I also really liked the tension that I was feeling about this question of like, how did Jill die? I'm like, what's the story with Jill? Like all of a sudden at some point I was like, wait, I'm dying to hear how it is dying. I'm, very curious to hear how it is that Jill died. And I was not disappointed. I felt like that whole storyline, it did seem a little bit absurd. And we don't actually know like why if Paul Bowman was trying to kill Lloyd, which is, I think, what we presume. That might even be like affirmed in the book, but we don't really know why, which is okay. I did like the idea of like wondering and then having this information meted out kind of slowly over the course of a few chapters because I was curious and I was getting the information as we were moving forward. I also really did like the idea of the mechanics of what was happening. I wasn't completely satisfied with it, but that was fine. I thought that the way that these people would be kind of like reconstituted and the way that they could all get together and like console each other or like do like some sort of like quick consultations, it was inventive and interesting and not like super convincing necessarily, but like a really interesting kind of thought exercise. So I really did enjoy the discussion of the mechanics. Okay, the last thing we're going to do today is take a look at the prose. It's just, it is such a joy to take a deeper look at this. And we're not going to do too much of it, but I do think it's really important to recognize that the prose in this book is excellent. His prose is kind of like never not excellent. It just is that we have very high expectations for what he is going to do with it because there are times when it just seems kind of otherworldly. It is so wise and so consoling and so inspirational. So I'm expecting a lot from George. Okay, so in the beginning here on pages 6 and 7, I wanted to just read a couple of things. And maybe the thing to keep in mind as I'm reading are these different registers. So we have this kind of folksiness, this kind of like simple nostalgia and like kind of innocence and optimism. But we also have like a very elevated kind of diction. And anyone who can incorporate all of those registers is really taking advantage of the breadth of language. So on page 6, this is right when Jill is like first meeting her charge. And here he was, a tiny crimped fellow in an immense mahogany bed. I was not too late. Neither was I too early. I mean, first of all, that's funny. I really like that. And it's not meant to be like ha-ha funny, but there's a certain levity to it. But it also is important. I mean, she's not too late. Like, he isn't dead, but she's like, but I'm also not too early because this guy's definitely going to die. But we have all of that is happening. But the idea of neither was I too early, that's an elevated kind of diction that for Jill Blaine, it's like giving her some kind of wisdom that she doesn't necessarily have as a gymnast. Okay, so just by virtue of how she is speaking, her syntax and her word choice, we have her as feeling kind of like wise and elevated. Okay, elevated. That is what she is. She has been given the gift of elevation. I'm going to start over. And here he was, a tiny crimped fellow in an immense mahogany bed. I was not too late, neither was I too early. His wife, exhausted by care, slept fully dressed on a love seat near the bed. Her slippers lay on the floor, turned in toward each other, as if being worn by some invisible pigeon-toed individual. But she was not my concern. My charge's sleeping clothes were of silk, his initials monogrammed above the heart. Moving closer, I entered the orb of his thoughts. Within him abided a formidable stubbornness, a steady flow of satisfaction, even triumph coursed through him, regarding all he had managed to do, see, cause, and create, especially given his humble origins. I scanned for doubts regarding things he had done or left undone, things he might have said but had not, mistakes to which he had not yet fully admitted, any of which might keep him from attaining that state of total peace so to be desired at this juncture, and found nothing, or nearly nothing. So things like, of total peace so to be desired at this juncture, we have that kind of elevated diction, but then underneath it, and found nothing, or next to nothing. So some very simple declarative sentences. So we get the sense right from the beginning that Jill has a certain amount of authority, but she also is this, slightly comical character who is, landing like with her feet bicycling up in the air, next to the statue of the dog and the duck. And then right across the page, we have this. I moved to the window to energize and activate that part of myself from which I comforted by glimpsing out indulgently at the glory of all that is. To my surprise, down below, near the statue of the golden dog, stood one of our ilk, looking up. And then a few pages later, we see like this idea of these different registers really kicks into high gear because we have Jill who still has this kind of like authority as this person who is elevated, but we also see her remembering her childhood. So a lot of the diction becomes kind of childlike. I was interested in the fact that George Saunders was leaning so heavily on quotation marks. So, I can, as I'm reading through, I can indicate this, but like school desk is in quotation marks. I think he's, signaling that these are things that are rare kind of artifacts that are drumming up all of her nostalgia. But I'm not sure that we needed I feel like that would have happened anyway, even without the quotation marks. So here we are on page 10. This is her, she's remembering. Jill is sort of becoming more Jill than she usually is. I'm digging away at the surface of school desk with the point of compass from Sears as Mrs. Kiley drones on. The lesson, as always, eludes me. So the idea of eluding, like clearly that's a different kind of register than school desk. This very kind of like plain and more like kind of youthful, not to say like childlike language. What I want is to go home and play pretty pedals. That, at least, I am good at. Through a nearby window, so close I might reach over and touch it if I dared, which I don't, 3 children, too young for school, play among gently swaying swing-set seats. Lucky ducks. Butterflies dart about, seemingly more quickly or slowly in proportion to the joy in the children's voices. The more joy, the more agitated the butterflies. Darn it. To my chagrin, I now recalled Jill Blaine, Jill Doll Blaine. In the bygone days, that, alas, had been me. So it's so interesting because as we're moving through, we have this register, but it's getting more and more kind of folksy as well. This idea of darn it. It sounds like kind of a childlike way for her to be expressing this emotion. But then we have this idea of to my chagrin. And then we also, so we're kind of attaching both of like this childlike language is attached deeply to her childhood, but it's also kind of it's like making these incursions into her adult vocabulary too. She still has that innocence. Of course, she was 22 when she died, but you get the sense of her as being like a very innocent 22-year-old who's saying, darn still. So I want to now kind of quickly read a paragraph that is from the perspective of K.J. Boone, partially because I actually think it's a good illustration of how repellent he is. This is a time when he's kind of explaining in a way that might be kind of compelling to the reader about how his job was important. This is also some very serious rationalizing that he is doing at this point. But there is so much anger behind it that I was like, wow, this is not someone that I can relate to, or it's not someone I want to sympathize with, because he's making some points that are actually like pretty salient points about how gasoline that comes from oil is very helpful in a lot of regards. But the arguments that he's choosing are so angry. And all I can do now is hear them in like Stephen Rood's. I hope that's his name. I think that's right. But I can only hear them in his voice. But I'm going to read this relatively quickly without any analysis or anything, just so that you can hear the really effective ways that Saunders is like conjuring this whole other person, just given the sound of his voice. And also, this is a very adept narrator. I didn't discuss this earlier, but a lot of it is first person. But then we very effectively can kind of shift into the voices, into the mind and voices of these other characters. So on 34, we have this. Did that frog, he's talking about the Frenchman, did that frog have any idea how much motor fuel it took for the U.S. to have one normal year like we just now had? 150 billion gallons. 150 billion. Try to work your head around that, Pierre, if you can. Get hold of a gas container of the type used to gas up a lawnmower. Get hold of a lot of them. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you were in the gas can business. Ha ha. Line them up side by side. To get 150 billion gallons, that line of cans is going to need to go around the world. Wait, not just once, not twice, 1,000 times. And somebody has to go out there and find the stuff, right? Get it out of the ground, process it, deliver it. Was that easy? It was not. Take it from someone who'd actually done it. Otherwise, what? Did the frog want to start rationing? Was that the notion? Rationing fuel? Who was going to run that deal? Some vast international bureaucracy? Feel good about that, Jacques? Think that's going to be an efficient process? Been to the UN lately? The post office? And guess who'd get hurt the most? If the hand-wringers get their way, brought the whole deal to a halt. The poor, that's who. Those who have the least. What's the tide that lifts all boats? Continual growth. Is continual growth a given? It is not. So I think you can hear like the anger here. And again, like a lot of this was very interesting to me. Like there were some facts in here and some arguments that could have been sort of compelling, but the anger was like such that I kind of couldn't I couldn't join with KJ about like the fact that some of what he had done also did have some advantages. I think it's interesting. Anytime I go back and read through these things, especially out loud, all this stuff jumps out at me. But the idea of rationing, when he mentions that a couple of different times, and part of me is like, no, let's not ration gas. Let's just figure out better public transportation and or electric vehicles. KJ. But when you have this idea of rationing, you also are thinking of rationalizing. Or I'm not sure that you are, but you know, you have that idea. There's the seed of the idea of rationalizing, because he is. I mean, what this is just a giant exercise in rationalizing all of the terrible things that have come from all this burning of fossil fuels. So partially just, again, to revel in this prose, I want to read a section that is speaking about the manifestation of one of these spirits. And this was so interesting to me. And I picked up on the kind of mechanics of this, but I didn't fully understand the import of what's happening here until I heard Saunders articulate it, which is that some of the, I mean, I guess maybe if you'd like made me sit down and write a short answer essay, I might have been able to get to this, but I was not there yet. The idea that when he is, some of these ghosts, some of the spirits are actually spirits who are arriving to talk to him, and some of them are things that he is making up in his mind. And Jill is helping him distinguish between the two. What Saunders said that was interesting and added to my sense of that is that the ones that he is making up are different parts of his psyche that he's kind of arguing with. So he's having these like internal debates with these spirits who are arriving, who are not ghosts. They are in fact, figments of, or like parts of himself that are manifesting as these, interlocutors. So on 35, it's actually Jill who is arriving to him, and he is beginning to kind of understand what is happening to him. Also, apologies in advance if my dogs are going crazy. I keep waiting for them to stop barking, and they're not stopping barking, so we're going to carry on. How odd, he felt, an imaginary woman manifesting so specifically. What are you then, he said, ghost? Oh, dear man, I said, a friend. A friend, he said. Of sorts, I said, here to comfort you in your hour of need. Doing a bang-up job so far, he said. You want to comfort me? Yes, I said. Keep Frenchie out, he said. I'll do my best, I said. But even as I spoke, the Frenchman fell in through the ceiling, so emaciated as to be nearly unrecognizable, all but lost in the familiar pair of mechanic's overalls. He got up, dusted himself off. Madame, he said, tell me, how long does it seem to you that I've been gone? To me? To me, it seems like 5 years, vraiment. 5 years of toil, resulting in a tremendous achievement, as you will now see. Let us begin. Begin what? I said. In response, he performed a stiff, hideous dance of anticipation. Sweet Christ, my charge whispered. Steady, I said. Commençons, the Frenchman shouted. A bird swooped into the room, a single bird. It landed on the bedpost at the foot of my charge's bed, let out a bright, summoning call. So that's the beginning, of course, of when all of the birds are coming in. But part of what I also wanted to highlight there is this idea of absurdity. So you have, obviously, as he is creating this kind of, system by which all of these spirits are going to help people transition into this next phase, helping them through the process of death, you're going to have to imagine what that is, and you're going to have to give it some kind of character. And what it is a lot of absurdity. It's a lot of, to the point where some of it feels like a little bit camp. And sometimes that worked for me, and sometimes it was a little bit less effective. Honestly, I kept thinking of the Brief and Frightening Reign of Phil. That is a very short novella, and Saunders wrote it as a challenge. Somebody, I think it was a friend or a fellow writer, said that they were challenging him to write a story that had no human beings in it, where everything was like an inanimate object. And so the main character in that book is like a belt buckle. And it sounds absurd, because it is absurd. You cannot believe the amount of emotion that we get out of like a belt buckle. It's like, we are just going to have to dive into that book. And the last thing I want to look at before we move into the very final part of the book is the way that this is situated, again, it's situated a long time ago, like middle of last century. And when George Saunders is anchoring the kind of this kind of Bardo-esque kind of world, this like shadowy world where these spirits are helping this dying man, you do have it occasionally very anchored in history in a way that is very impressive and very helpful for the reader. I also want to read this because it's funny, and we get the sense of kind of like the outlandishness when it's working really well. So this is when you have the guys who both have the same name, and so they each go by the first initial of their last name. Their names are actually Mel. I think I said Ron earlier, but it's definitely Mel. Okay, so on 61. Doesn't every idea, said R, even those judged by some standards to be fallacious, or those which have been disproven outright, deserve to be honored with the public's attention? Doesn't the public have a right to know, said G, and decide for itself, said R? Are you calling the public stupid, said G? Do you not believe in democracy, said R? R turned to me. We were, in life, eminent scientists, he said. We practically won World War II, said G, if that's not overstating it. It's not, said R. I'd say you're understating it. Because why? Atomic bomb, said G. Pretty big deal, said R. The biggest, said G. Kaboom, said R. War over, said G. Democracy wins, said R. Hence our stellar reputations, said G. Having done our part to save the world, we widened our gaze, said R. Broadened our stances, said G. Filled our coffers, said R. Created a more inclusive national debate on several vital issues, said G. Stirred up the shit, said R. Profited, said G. Insanely, said R. This is like an absolute masterclass. We should just spend a whole hour talking about this, but I'm only going to touch on a couple of things, which is you have all of these platitudes and all of these kind of euphemisms for stuff that like really, I mean, when you say something like fallacious, meaning falsified, meaning like a lie, you elevate the diction to a point where it loses any of its sting. Also, of course, you know, they're talking about the idea of like this incredibly destructive force that has a lot of, meaning the atomic bomb, that is very controversial in the sense that it may have saved many other lives. We wish it were not necessary. Like there are all these different arguments that you can make, and yet they are making this one very like clear argument, and then they're tying it to the idea of democracy, but then they're shifting back down into the ideas of how insanely they profited. So you have this idea of like a very complex thing happening here in this very economical way, because it's like one page between these two men, but it tells us everything we need to know about KJ and his ability to do the same sort of thing, the same kind of rationalizing, but also the self-aggrandizement and the euphemisms and obfuscating and like kind of changing the subject and really talking himself into this kind of rationale. It is so good. Okay, we're going to finish up by just jumping toward the end of the book here. So if you have not finished it and you don't want to hear stuff that's happening at the very end, I don't even know if it's that much of a giveaway. I mean, I think you can imagine what happens at the end of the book. It is, I mean, there is an element of like spoiling things here, but I mean, I think, you know, it's pretty clear where this thing is headed. But on page 159, we have this thing that to me felt kind of Buddhist. And those of you who've listened for a while know that I'm really deeply committed to my Buddhist thinking these days, and the Buddhist conception of death to me is a much it's a very comforting kind of thing, and so I was very happy that George kind of like brought us back there, at least to a certain extent. So on 159 we have this: he began truly dying. His mind was no longer accessible to me. He was no longer thinking, not in the conventional sense, had begun the transition, was merging with all that is, leaving the husk of himself behind, becoming something both more and less than he had ever been before. So I love this idea of you know, at death, our energy, our spirit returns to wherever it was before we were born, in the sense that we are leaving this mortal body and returning into to whatever it is we came out of in this kind of comforting way. I thought it was so interesting. At the bottom of this page, we have this like deeply romantic thing where he's kind of where KJ is kind of visited by his mother and father, and we have this kind of like deeply romantic moment. And the romantic in me was like really excited that maybe Saunders was offering up this concept, which I will read to you here, of like two people becoming one. So on the bottom of 159. Then his mother went over, hungrily embraced his father, put her mouth greedily on his, and the two became one. So I was like, wow, at this moment when KJ is like, you know, like becoming one with all that is, we also have this idea of his mother and father becoming one. Oh my God, I'm so sorry about the dogs. This is like a terrible time for them to be barking. But the two become one, and I was like, maybe this is what's happening. Maybe two are going to become one, and he's going to say that that's something that can also happen at death. But no, it's like 4 or 5 pages later, we in fact have them separating again. So the other thing that was both interesting and kind of comforting to me is this kind of theory that Jill Blaine has. So I want to read through this. It's on page 171. Something was bothering me. I had perhaps overstepped by my intervention vis-a-vis the Mells. I'd been, tell the truth, pretty darn rough on them. And weren't they also inevitable? Inevitable occurrences, upon which, therefore, it would be impossible, even ludicrous, to pass judgment. And hadn't I just passed judgment on them, quite harshly, by lacerating them into sections, hollowing them out, then filling them with concrete and all of that? Which is actually really funny. Well, sure. I mean, I guess I'd kind of dropped the ball on that one. Therein lay the danger of existing out of elevation, of retaining even a trace of one's former self. One's pity became constricted. One judged, one preferred, one acted, and, in acting, erred. One screwed the pooch, felt crappy about it later. So, the time had come for me to be frank with myself, with that dual we, to say to that sweet, treasured but harmful Jill portion that lingered within me still, that we were finished and I must go on without her. Yes, yes, she seemed to say, I get it, I get that, but just don't forget me. But forgetting her was exactly what I meant to do. So what is, again, so comforting here to me is this idea that we have like some sort of earthly manifestation here on earth in our physical body, but that we are a kind of energy that is going to return to the universe that doesn't have all of the trappings and all of the sufferings and all of the concerns and all of the like pity, action, all this kind of stuff. I mean, I'm not saying I know what that energy is all about, but we have this idea of in this very Buddhist way, of leaving behind Jill Blaine, leaving behind that specific manifestation and moving back into this kind of universal energy. So I really love the way that she's tying together the idea of like an inevitable occurrence, that there's the idea of like predestination, you are always going to be who you are going to be. But then this idea of like a larger sense of what does happen after we die, which is that we do kind of merge with this universe, with this kind of energy that we were part of before we were ever manifested as Jill Blaine, for example. So we're going to read the last section of the book, and honestly, I kind of wish that we could have ended on that portion that I just read before, because this is the portion that I do not like as much, just because it's not quite as optimistic and not quite as comforting to me. But it's very important that this is the note on which Saunders is leaving the book. And I really like the idea of she at this point is finding another charge. She's moving toward another person who she can comfort. So we have this on 174. In some ways, we have a conclusion to this story, and then we are moving on with this idea of a whole other experience for her, which presumably she will do more effectively. Okay, so on 174, this is the last part of the book. A woman was dying in that cabin. Somehow I knew it was a woman. I felt again the old, familiar, generalized fondness. She had not willed herself into this world and was now being taken out of it by force. The many subsystems within her that had always given her so much satisfaction shutting down agonizingly. Soon it would come, accompanied by disbelief and panic, and she would find herself on the wrong side of a rapidly closing door. Everything she had ever known and loved out of reach, over there, beyond it. At such moments I especially cherished my task. I could comfort. I could. Thank you, I whispered, and vowed to seek elevation forevermore. It's just really a strong finish, and I am also going to leave it there. I hope that this has given you more of a sense of what this book is up to, what it is trying to achieve, and the many ways that the prose is incredible, and all of the sort of strengths and talents of George Saunders that we see manifest here in ways that are so good. I think just for some of us, it didn't quite meet the very, very high expectations that we often bring to the work of someone who is so clearly a genius. So I hope you got something out of this, and I hope you come back soon. Happy reading.